Hello. I would call myself an accidental educator. I only realized 3 or 4 years ago that what I was doing was actually part of an entire movement called project-based learning, that people were practicing the principles of open source education, of sharing tools, and I was amazed to find that there were so many other people that had already covered ground that we were just learning about. And our journey is one that's really, really simple. I think the most radical thing that you could possibly do is to explain to somebody a word or a term or a principle that they never knew. And I love it when I share ideas with people and I see that little flicker in their eyes, which means that I got past the barrier and into their brain, and I planted a thought bomb. That might go off in a week, a day, a year, 5 years from now. Because ideas, as everybody in this room knows, once they're learned, they're very difficult to unlearn. And so how do you get words to people? Because I really think that words are the building blocks for ideas. If you have words, you can frame an idea, you can have a conversation, you can shift somebody's consciousness. Any conversation about words would probably have to start with Confucius. And this is a statement that was not something that I discovered. It was actually given to me. I was in Washington State. I was on a farm that had been completely wiped out by a flood caused by the stripping of timber on the mountains above this farm that had caused all the topsoil and all of the water to rush down into this river and wipe out his farm. And he said, nobody understands all of these principles and all these terms, how everything connects together. Nobody understands what a riparian buffer is. Nobody understands what protective barriers are in farming and cover crops. He said, I would love it if you could explain those ideas to people. And then when I got home in my email box was this quote from Confucius about the precision and the importance of language. Because if language is not correct, then what is said is not what is meant. If what is said is not what is meant, then what must be done remains undone. Moral and art deteriorate. But more importantly, justice goes astray. All because we lose the commonality of language. Hence, there should be no arbitrariness. The importance of clarity, the importance of actually having a shared language. This single principle really became the driving force behind the Lexicon of Sustainability, which my wife and I created 5 years ago. Words are important, and we see every day confusion about words. We can start here, actually. A group comes together, seize power, name themselves the Islamic State. But are they a state? And do they represent Islam? Somebody decides to call them ISIS, taking actually how the group describes themselves and translating it into this term. Then that's not appropriate, they call them ISIL. And as we've seen, if we've read the news since the Paris attacks a few weeks ago, in England, in Parliament, in the Bundestag in Germany, in France, there is a movement to actually even redefine this term and call them a term that actually what they're known in most of the Arab world, which is really provocative because to use this term to describe the Islamic State is actually a death sentence in the Islamic State. It's all about how we frame ideas. It's all about what we call things, what we consensually understand to be what our shared language is. And literally, there's a battle over that. We're seeing that right now just with Daesh. But we see that everywhere. This is the emblem of climate change, and it's an absurd emblem. It's an absurd emblem because we're given the impression that we put the polar bear on this ice floe. We don't know what we did to get him there. We don't know how we're going to get him off. And as a matter of fact, most people when they actually do studies, when they take polls, have what's called climate fatigue. They did not know what a carbon debt was the first time they heard it, or the 10th time, or the 50th time. But on the 51st time that they heard carbon debt, they literally had permission to check out of the conversation because nobody had actually managed to explain to them what a core idea or principle was. If we don't understand what the words are, we can't form the idea. If we can't form the idea, we can't have a conversation. It all starts with words. Words matter. It's the Bible. And it's in Latin. And it was in Latin until the 1300s, which was great because it was a common Bible across all of Europe, but not great if you couldn't read Latin. And as it turns out, most people in Europe couldn't read Latin. You had to depend upon your village priest or your bishop to actually explain to you what was in the fundamental text that governed your daily life. And then this guy had this idea, John Wycliffe, to actually translate the Bible into a language that people could understand. And if anybody in this room is a follower of history, they know that things did not end very well for John Wycliffe. Not only did he die a very unhappy and very unrespected, unacknowledged man, but then they dug up his grave and they burnt his bones and crushed them to dust and threw them into a river. So there'd be no record of this man who had attempted to actually render the Bible in a form that people could actually understand. That's the power of language. It's the power of words. This is the bread that you probably bought this week. You also are in a really troubling situation because you have no idea what's in your own bread. And it turns out food companies strive really, really hard to actually make it so you don't understand, so you actually can't ask questions, so you actually can't have transparency about what it is that you're eating. And that's the fundamental problem, right? Because we have no idea who makes our food, what's in it, and how it gets to us. It's the problem we have in education. Systems that are opaque, that beg for transparency. When my wife and I looked at sustainability, we thought the big challenge was that nobody had any idea what these principles were, like what they meant. Like, what does sustainability actually look like? What does it sound like? What does it talk like when people talk to each other who actually know these subjects intimately? So we thought, let's find these people. Let's go around the United States. Let's ask people to explain the terms, the ideas, the principles, but most importantly, the solutions to sustainability in their communities. We don't focus on problems. We only focus on solutions because every solution has a problem embedded within it. And it's too easy to fall prey to what I call these crisis cults who focus only on the negativity of things, which is so easy to point out as it turns out, but it's actually so hard to build resolution from. So we thought, what if we took that language, what if we took those solutions, those people, and brought them together and created this lexicon of sustainability? It's been a 5-year journey only on food, going around the United States. And it's had its ups and downs. The hardest thing was, how were we going to communicate it in a way that was portable? How were we going to take these ideas, these words, these principles, and make them so that they could be easily translated, easily passed from one person to the other? I'm a filmmaker and a photographer, and one of the things about photography that's always bothered me is that it's just a moment in time. Stories have a beginning, middle, and end. Photographs are just a sliver of that. What if I could introduce time into a photograph? What if I could actually make photographs that had beginnings and middle and ends? So what I did was, I took a guy named Will Allen in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, an amazing man who had the epiphany that he could raise fish indoors in low-income communities, literally in boxes. And then he could take those fish, which you see on the right, and you could take the wastewater from those fish, run it up to wood-framed gardens above the fish, and you could actually grow produce. And then from that waste, you could actually raise worms. And you actually could build 3 businesses: vermiculture, this produce business, and this protein business, this fish business, all in warehouses. And he just started in Milwaukee. And how could I do that in one photograph? And I realized I really couldn't. So what I did was, instead of taking one photograph, I took 1,000. And slowly, over the course of 6 hours working with Will and his very patient team, I put together a series of images that became a moment in time that actually, in reality, never existed. I told the story of Will and the people that work in this urban farm. You know, there's a popular phrase that people use that, a picture's 1,000 words, but it's so wrong. Because actually, a picture's 1,000 questions, especially if it's a good picture. You want to know what's happening. Why is that person in that car? What is that thing that they're holding in their hand? You always have questions whenever you look at a photograph. You always want to know what it is you're looking at. So I thought, why not have Will explain it? Why not have Will explain to me what vermiculture is, what aquaponics is? Why not show you that there's action, there's movement happening? This is not just a single moment in time. Give people names, tell you where it's happening, and then ask Will to give me the one term, the one principle that explains what it is that he's about. And for Will, it's nothing short of a good food revolution, which is actually the title of his last book. Then you wrap it up with a narrative that explains where you are and why you're there. Ironically, if you look at an article in the New York Times, if you break it down, if you figure out all of those pieces, there's a title in a New York Times article, there's a subline, there's the place that tells you where it's taking place, there might be a photograph. It's literally a deconstructed way that a journalist approaches a story. And then when you put it all together, you get an explanation of the Good Food Revolution from Will Allen, taken in the place where Will wants you to understand what he does. We've made literally hundreds of these information artworks all over the United States, explaining all kinds of principles, each one in these people's own words. The interesting thing about that journey was it taught us terms and principles that we would have never known and allowed people who were the experts in these the opportunity to frame it in a very clear way that would allow them to give it to us so that we could bring it to a larger audience. And what we've been able to do is identify really what we think are the terms and trends that are going to really shift in terms of our food system, what the biggest ideas are. Usually, about this point, there's a sector of an audience, especially maybe today, that's skeptical. And they might be thinking, dude, it's just a bunch of words. Slow down. But the thing about it is, words are so powerful, they can actually shift entire industries just by teaching people what they are. There's power in words. And I'm going to give you two examples. Monsanto introduced a growth hormone into the dairy chain 25 years ago that would get cows to produce more milk, which, if you're a dairyman, is a pretty cool idea. You're going to get all this extra milk. But if you're a cow, it's a pretty bad idea because it's a tremendous amount of overproduction that you're actually not designed as a cow to do. And some dairymen thought, what if I actually don't use RBST? What if I actually don't give it to my cows? Now, I'm at a competitive disadvantage. I'm producing 30% less milk than my neighbor. But, I have values. I don't want to mistreat my animals. So this one farmer, this one dairyman in Ohio, did the bold move of actually putting on his milk carton, no RBST. Which begs the question, what is RBST? What happened? Well, Monsanto took him to court, not for what was in his milk, but for what wasn't in his milk. And the amazing end to that story is that he won, and that Monsanto actually sold that part of their business off. All because consumers learned what a term was. We're able, for a brief moment, to have an opaque food system suddenly become a little bit more transparent. We're given an opportunity to make a purchase based upon their values, and by doing so, changed an entire industry. All because they learned a word. And we're seeing that with eggs, but I could go on and on and on. We're seeing this again and again, that when you create mechanisms that introduce concepts to people in a way that they can clearly understand it, and you give people the opportunity to then make a choice, most usually based upon their value system, change happens. That's the power of words. And, obviously, it's why it's the focus of our project. Our project is about climate change. Something that we usually never say, because we are battling this climate fatigue that people have. But the three big drivers of climate change are food, water, and energy, which is what we focus on: food, water, and energy. For the last year, we haven't released any of our work in water, so you're seeing images that we haven't actually released yet. We have been focused on water, working with a lot of partners and taking all of their ideas and building a taxonomy. The under-the-hood explanation of our system is we reach out to literally hundreds of experts and conduct tens of thousands of pages of interviews. From those interviews, invariably, whenever you talk to anybody who's an expert in something, they're going to explain to you terms and principles that you don't know. We then ask them to stop and define that. And then when we go to the next person, they say things we don't know. They define that. And they also define their own definitions of the first terms that we heard from the other person. So over time, we build a crowdsourced and peer-reviewed taxonomy of the words people talk about when they talk about something. When experts get together and share ideas, what are the big concepts? How do they use those words to explain those concepts? And how can we share them with a larger audience? How can we help to disseminate these big ideas? So from all of these conversations with all of these amazing experts who volunteer all their time for us, we actually come up with a taxonomy that reflects what people talk about when they talk about water. So just like with food, we end up with all kinds of images of things that you might not even know. When the EPA, for example, created the Clean Water Act in 1972, they realized, well, we want to have clean water, but there's just no possible way that the EPA can monitor every water system, every stream in the entire country. So they come up with the amazing idea to actually let anybody in the country get certified to do water samples, to do water tests, and that if they found something that was wrong with their water, they could actually file a citizen suit in court. And people began anointing themselves citizen water monitors. That's my father-in-law, as it turns out. All these years I didn't know what he was doing when he got up at 5 o'clock in the morning, and then I figured out what he was doing. And we have been explaining California's drought and the way that water is inequitably distributed in the Central Valley, looking at laws that date back over 100 years that inequitably work out who gets access to water and who doesn't, and looking at all the problems we have with dams and how they are so damaging to the environment, and on and on and on. Looking at power. This is in Hawaii. This is in the Middle East, looking at solar power. It's a project that takes the power of words and then tries to magnify them. One of the central premises of our work is the idea that ideas must be portable. They must be able to be taken and placed wherever people are gathering to talk about something. So how do we do that? Well, we have a series of short films we do with PBS, which you can go online today to pbs.org or all over the web to find our films, of which there's dozens and dozens of films. And what's interesting about the films that we make is we actually made a deal with PBS. We got them to buy into the concept of promiscuous distribution. The idea that you want to put it everywhere, not just on a PBS website, because inevitably it will breadcrumb back to you. They had never done that before. They operated what was called a rose garden, where they kept everything inside of their pbs.org site, but we actually convinced them to take a different tack. So now you can find these films wherever there's people having conversations about fixing our food system. We also print these images. Anybody in this room can go to our website today, Lexicon of Sustainability.com, and you can say, I want to do 5 shows in my town. These are the 5 places I'm going to do it. A library, my child's school, a farmer's market, in City Hall. And we will actually send you a box that has 24 images from our project in it. You get to keep it. The radicalness of that has resulted in over 1,000 shows all over the United States by hundreds and hundreds of curators who have never curated anything before, but who were intimately involved in their community and intimately focused on one basic fact, which is that they're not waiting for anybody to fix their food system. They're going to just fix it themselves. And it all starts with giving people access to information. So the bottom right is a climate conference that was held in Central Park. They moved it across the street from the conference and they put it right in the park so people who were just passing by in the park could write all of, people began leaving notes that they began taping and placing on the pictures, and you can see these notes everywhere that people were leaving. Upper right is a elementary school in South Central Los Angeles. The far left is a street fair in Amarillo, Texas, which I'll get back to. And the middle one is a conference called Slow Money that's all about injecting money into local food systems. The far left was a really powerful one for us because they took our images to an elementary school class, and all the kids had to make images inspired by what they saw. So that kid was there in the picture because he had also made his picture, his Lexicon of Sustainability picture, about his food system in Amarillo, Texas. And that image always stuck with us, and I'll get back to that in a second. We also make it so you can go to our website, you can download pictures in black and white, print them at Kinko's or wherever, have painting parties, and put them everywhere. So you might have seen these in many urban areas across the US. We don't actually condone plastering images on walls, though we do have a recipe for how to make the plaster to do that. So not to do at home, right? But it's great. You can get them in English, you can get them in Spanish, you can get them without words. A lot of times people like to put their own words on them. All part of this idea of making content portable, of getting information to where people are. We publish books. We have a book that came out with HarperCollins last year called Local. We do things on the web. And lastly, we built a lexicon of food, where we gathered all of these people, all of these ideas, all these solutions in one place so it could be a resource for others to draw from and add to. And that's at lexiconoffood.com. In the midst of all of this, one of our curators was a high school in Ames, Iowa. And these high school students did 20 shows with our artwork around Iowa. And you would think Iowa is not going to be very receptive to ideas like ours, so how is that going to work, right? And as it turns out, these kids, their teacher said, they want to talk to you, Douglas. Can you get on Skype with them? So I get on Skype, and I'm expecting the students to say, this is great, we've done all these shows, it's fantastic. Instead, they say, there's a problem with your show, which is that there's nobody from Iowa in the pictures. And I said, guys, I'm not coming to Iowa. I'm too busy, I got all these other things. They said, no, we're going to make these pictures ourselves. Just tell us how to do it. So I told them I think about it. I told my wife at dinner last night, my wife who's been here this week, who actually runs the Lexicon, I don't run it. She had been working on a curriculum of how you would translate this into something that could be used in schools. And she said, well, this might be an interesting case because, it's that famous song, if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere. If you can actually succeed in Iowa, then you could actually probably do this anywhere in the US. So a week later, even though I told her I would never do it, she had me on a plane to Iowa. And the way that we worked it out was this. The way that our system of investigation is, we say, what is a food system? What does your food system look like? Who is part of your food system? What are their practices? How can you document it? And then lastly, and most importantly, who can you share this with in your community? And we didn't really know what project-based learning was, but it turns out there's an interesting overlap between the principles of project-based learning and what we had mapped out here. And a week later, I got on a plane and I went to Iowa. And I explained to students how to actually make these types of pictures, how to put those ideas together. And this is an image made by a 16-year-old who told me, can I make a picture with my phone because I've never used a camera? Is a phone a camera? And then she said, do I have to use Photoshop? I don't use computer programs. I'm not a Photoshop person. And then she said, I don't know how to draw on a photograph. and that's what ended up 2 weeks later. Another 16-year-old explaining the biggest challenge in farming in Iowa, which is flooding, and how they have this very efficacious way to get water off their fields. Super technical, super amazing explanation. So amazing that what we did was we thought, we can't just leave these as just a show that they're doing to take around Iowa, which they did. They've done about 75 shows in Iowa. There's so much a bigger opportunity here. So what we did was we rented the metro station in Washington, D.C., directly under the USDA. And we said, this is what kids in Iowa are doing to explain sustainable agriculture in Iowa. The USDA, who had ignored our project up to that point, suddenly had its workers having to walk past these artworks every day on the way to work. And ironically, it's the Smithsonian stop, so also people from the Smithsonian. So we got 2 calls. The Smithsonian gave us a call, and USDA. We brought the kids to D.C. It was a very powerful, very amazing experience. Not only did they hold a show there underneath the USDA in this metro station, but they also were invited to Capitol Hill, where they met policymakers, where they met legislators not only from their states, but people who were the architects of our food bill. And it was an amazing experience. We had a show in the Rayburn building, and one of the senators there said to one of the students, I'm just so impressed, young lady. You're just explaining these pictures, and you have so much enthusiasm, and it's such a pretty picture, and you're not even afraid talking to me. I'm a U.S. senator. And I was off to the side watching this, and she just looked at him and a little bit taken aback, and she said, Senator, I was freaked out about my Spanish midterm 2 weeks ago. I know this farmer. I've been with this farmer. He and I worked on this together. I really intimately know his problem and the solution that he has here. So all I'm here is just the ambassador of his ideas. And that's the power of a project like this, when students actually go to the USDA and explain practices that are important in their state, or when they go onto Capitol Hill and meet with policymakers. It was such an interesting experience, we began to expand it. We began to say, how can we get this to a larger, even larger audience? And how can we also be cognizant that if you talk about food in North America, you're not just talking about the US, you're talking about Mexico. So we went down to Mexico. We translated everything into Spanish, started in Oaxaca and Sierra Gorda and Guadalajara, and we made the most basic rookie mistake you can make, which is that we just translated our work into Spanish and went down there. Beginner's mistake. And I remember the first show we had, and somebody was looking at it, and they were looking at a picture that explained organics. I remember a student turned to another student and said, yeah, that's really important for those Americans, this idea of organics. Certainly not important in Mexico, I can tell you. Now, talk about GMOs is a different story. You can go to the most remote village in Mexico, and everybody knows the argument and the story about GMOs. So we realized in Mexico we had to completely start over again. So our project localized curriculum completely changed to reflect not only the principle of sustainability, but the principle of capacity building. But we followed that same formula, got together with the students. These are Mazateco students who actually taught in Mazateco in Oaxaca. These are students in Guadalajara who went through exactly the same process and again began making images in Spanish to explain their food systems. More importantly was the exhibition part of it. Suddenly we had people calling to ask us if these kids could do TEDx's, could actually speak in public to explain their work, and if they could put together shows that would travel all over, in this case, Guadalajara, and to come and explain their works, to come and bring people from the community in. And local policymakers began to get involved down in Guadalajara. I won't get into the details of what's happened down there, but it's been a very amazing journey. And of course, because the kids in Guadalajara knew that the kids in Iowa did a show at a metro station, they did one in Guadalajara. And they were proud because there's a much bigger metro station in Guadalajara, 50,000 or 6,000 people a day passing through the artwork. And it was a big thing that ended up in all of the national press in Mexico. And we're now on to our second year and expanding across Mexico, and hopefully I'll get into that. The interesting thing about this is now that we have schools that have been doing this for 2 or 3 years, and they're saying, Laura, food's cool, but there's so many other things, so many other ideas. How can we use Project Localize to go at other things? So we said, well, what if we took the system of how you can put a problem in here and have it go through a mechanism of investigation and storytelling and come out with solutions over here? How could we templatize that? So we decided to look at a really challenging story, which was a story in Iowa. I don't expect any of you to know this, but it's impossible to get industrial agriculture to be responsible for what it does because they have a way to externalize all the costs and all the impacts of what they do. Like in the case of agriculture, all these nitrates that end up in the water and all these dead zones that end up in oceans. Partially because you can't actually hold them responsible because you can actually say your water polluted from this exact place. But in Iowa, through a series of events I won't bother to explain, they figured out a way to do it finally. Des Moines Water Works has water for 500,000 people in their state that has to be treated by the largest nitrate removal facility in the world because of all of the farming practices there. And they found a way to sue their upstream partners. I won't get into the details of it. And so our students in Iowa said, what would happen if we got together and focused just on this lawsuit and its meaning and its potential impact for the entire nation? So the teachers and I got together, and this is like the dream story. They took an English teacher, a biology teacher, and a civics teacher. They had hundreds of seniors from Ames High School apply. They chose 60 of them. And their principal created a class with these teachers where 2 hours a day, every day, they're spending an entire year looking at Iowa water. And it's all built around the principles of Project Localize. So how did we do it? Well, we said, this is the basic idea. What do you want to explore? What is the past of your story? In other words, how were things before this problem that you want to address? What is this problem now? And then what are the solutions? What's the future? What's going to come out of this? And then from that, where would you show this? Where would you explain the story? How would you find the places that graphically, visually make us understand why this is so important? And then from the places, who are the people? Because every work that we do is about people explaining things in their own terms. Who are those people? And once you get people together, you obviously, of course, because our project is about words, you get people using words to describe these things. And so we actually taught these kids in Iowa to create a taxonomy to explain water in Iowa. Totally focused on solutions. And they did it in a collaborative process. And then what they did was they got in buses and they drove around the state. And they met all those experts who explained to them all of those things that they needed to know to fill out this taxonomy. They asked questions. They were taken back to show how water is actually cleaned and how nitrates are removed. And they became journalists. They were investigators of information. And from that amazing journey, they revisited this taxonomy they built and came up with a much more precise one. That was their way that they wanted to explain the challenges of water in their state. This lexicon of water in Iowa. And using this principle that we use in Project Localize, they began to make images to explain otherwise very complicated ideas. These are all images made by high school seniors to explain what is otherwise a very, very complicated subject. And what's powerful about this type of storytelling is that the students have ownership over this information. It wasn't something that they read in a book and then had a test on. It's actually something that they researched, came together, figured out what it was going to be, how it was going to fit together, how it was going to be a collaborative process, that each individual's story led into the other person's story. They would literally sit in rooms and say, I'm going to explain everything up to that part because I know you're going to explain it in yours, and then we'll make sure that they're in an order so that they see mine first, which then leads them naturally into yours. One of the most amazing parts of this project was after they made all these images, I said, why not make it a beginning, middle, and end? If you had to make a presentation, if you had to show these works to somebody, what would you do? How would you explain them beginning and middle and end? And they went, oh, right, because it's going to be a story in the end. It's going to be a story that tells the story of water. 3 days ago, they had their first show for a project that began in September. When people in the food world, on the science level, heard that I was doing this project with these students in Iowa, it created the typical backlash. The provost of Iowa State University actually circulated an email to faculty saying, this is Douglas Gayeton, this is what he looks like, this is a link to lectures he's done, this is a link to films he's made. You probably want to avoid this guy when he comes to Iowa. But of course that backfired, because there was a lot of people that didn't agree with the provost or didn't agree with that system, and I was flooded with emails that informed a lot of what we did. And to really drive it home, the students 2 days ago did their first show at Iowa State. Explaining to professors and scientists how you could fix your water system. This is just the start of a journey. I can't really get into the details of what we're going to do next, but it's going to make our whole experience with this subway in DC seem super trivial, because these kids are activated because they've been given information that they own, and they feel a need to share it with the community and to get it out, not only in Iowa, but across the US. They have recognized what was coursework in a classroom. They have built their own curriculum that was customized around it, and this is the output of their work. What's amazing is they're so powerful, these kids, that I put them on with the kids in Mexico to communicate with each other. And I went down to Guadalajara, and I went to other places, and I would have them talk by Skype. The kids in Iowa were so forceful, they convinced the kids in Mexico to take a challenge on. So now the kids in Guadalajara are spending an entire year looking at water quality in Guadalajara, which has some of the worst water pollution of any urban area in the Western Hemisphere. So in the spring, there'll be a show of the Guadalajara kids with their work and what these kids here are doing in Iowa. I think if you want to begin with a discussion about words, you can find no better place to start than with Confucius. But if you want to end being people that are in the 21st century, you would probably want to end with Wittgenstein. And it's a truism. Words are the building blocks for ideas. And when you can frame a complicated subject around those building blocks, when you can break things down into those small pieces, students can wrap their brains around those pieces and then from there build out. Our project is about, what we've realized is about ownership of ideas. Having people create something that they have ownership of, that they feel that they're really, really responsible for disseminating. We get approached now to create lexicons for a variety of subjects. And people ask us all the time, how do you build taxonomies? How do you build collections of words around ideas that are actionable? How do you do it? And I guess the challenge that I would give to everyone in this room, and ironically, it's actually why I'm here, is that we all can participate in creating a lexicon. It's why I first came together with ISKME. We can create a lexicon of innovation in education, of these principles and these practices. You know, I come here on a Saturday, having not had the opportunity to witness all these amazing ideas and principles that are all mapped out, and I hear terms. I hear terms like laboratory. You know, wouldn't it be amazing if somebody could actually see what that looks like? or see how to get there. And people could share all of those principles around a pretty amazing concept. Our taxonomies, as I mentioned earlier, are crowdsourced, and they're peer-reviewed. They are collectively gathered. Every day I have people sending me new ideas or new people or new things to document. Every idea is, or even better, which makes me even happier, is I get somebody saying to me, your explanation of this one thing is patently wrong. Why would that make me happy? Because in many cases, we're talking about things that are so new that the language around them is evolving, as I showed you with Daesh. All these terms, for example, in sustainability, are so new that they're not even set, and they're in many ways they're contextual. It's the limit of Wikipedia. Wikipedia is desperate to give you one way to understand something, when in many ways the context is so vast, it is rendered meaningless if you try to ascribe one definition to something that's here over here. Same way you could say about education. And that's what we are talking about at the Lexicon with this committee, this idea of how can we create a lexicon of innovation and education? What would it look like? How could it be a valuable resource, not only for the people in this room, but for the people that weren't able to be in this room? Because whenever I go to conferences like this, and I sit down and have breakfast, everybody here is pretty smart. Everybody here is an expert in something. We're all experts, but how do we leverage that combined knowledge? How do we take those individual things that we're all super smart? Anybody could be on the stage talking right now about the thing that they are knowledgeable about, and it would be interesting to everybody here. So how do we take that knowledge that each of us have, that area of expertise or experience, either in a positive experience or a negative experience that we learned from, and how can we find a way to bring all those ideas together in one place and share them with others? That's what we've done with food. That's what we're doing with water and energy. And that's what we would really love to do around innovation and education. So I'm going to end that here. And you can continue this with ISKME. And we can start to have a dialogue about how we can all collaborate in building that platform. My wife runs the Lexicon. This was something that she would always say to my daughter when she was 2 or 3 years old. We never gave our daughter baby food, and we never used baby talk because my wife always felt that we want to accelerate this child. We want to give this child all these tools from the beginning. And when we made our first graphics to explain what we were doing, she used that same term, and I find that very, very endearing. But I think it's true. I think words are powerful. Words are transformational, and words can shift people's consciousness. So I want to thank you for having me come this morning.